Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The wind whispered through the ancient hills, carrying echoes of voices long forgotten. It moved through the towering oaks and the rivers that had carved their way through the land for centuries, telling stories to those who truly listened. This was a land where gods once walked, where every shadow held a secret, and every gust of wind carried a message from beyond the veil of the mortal world. In the glow of twilight, as the sky deepened into hues of violet and amber, the earth itself seemed to hum with an unspoken energy. In the heart of this land stood an old traveler, his cloak tattered by the years, and his eyes reflecting the weight of countless stories. He had walked paths known and unknown, guided by forces even he did not fully understand. He moved like a man searching for something long lost, yet he carried no map, only memories. The world had changed, but the gods had not faded, not entirely. They still lingered in the bones of the earth, in the rivers that carried the past to the sea, in the firelight that danced like spirits on cold nights. Legends spoke of the Tuatha De Danann, the children of Danu, who had shaped this land with their will and walked among mortals as both gods and kin. It was said that when they arrived, the sky itself trembled and the mountains shifted beneath their feet. They were warriors and poets, sorcerers and kings, and they wove their magic into the very fabric of existence. No battle was fought without their presence, no harvest blessed without their touch. Their names were spoken in reverence, carried on the lips of bards who bound history and myth into song. But gods, like mortals, could not escape the turning of the wheel. Time moved forward, and the Tuatha De Danann were forced into the shadows, retreating into the hidden places of the world, the hills that pulsed with unseen magic, the lakes that shimmered like portals to another realm. They became the She, the hidden folk, their power woven into the land itself. And though they no longer walked among men in the open, they were never truly gone. The wind still carried their whispers. The crows still served as their messengers, and the rivers still ran with the memory of their presence. Among these gods, some names were feared more than others. There was the Dagda, the Great Father, whose laughter could shake the sky and whose cauldron never emptied. He was the keeper of life and death, the force that turned the seasons and held the balance between plenty and famine. There was Lug, the many-skilled, who shone like the midday sun, his spear unerring and his wisdom unmatched. And then there was the Morrigan, the Phantom Queen, who moved like a shadow across battlefields, her voice a song of fate, her presence an omen of death. The traveler had heard these stories many times, but he knew they were more than just tales. He had seen the flicker of something beyond mortal understanding, felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the depths of the forest. heard the crows call his name when no one else was near. The gods were waiting for a time when they would be remembered, not just in whispers, but in the voices of those who still walked the land. And so he walked on, guided by the wind, toward the ancient stones that marked a place where the veil between worlds was thin. The night deepened, and the stars above burned like watchful eyes. Somewhere, hidden beneath the roots of the old oak, something stirred. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old magic, the kind that had lingered long before men carved their names into stone. The traveler moved cautiously, his steps muffled by the moss-covered ground. The ancient stones loomed before him, standing tall like sentinels of a forgotten era. They were older than kings, older than written words, and beneath their weathered surfaces, they held the secrets of gods and men alike. He placed a hand against the cold stone, feeling the hum beneath his fingertips. This was a place of power, a threshold between worlds where time wove itself into spirals, much like the carvings etched deep into the rock. The she had not faded. They had merely stepped aside, retreating into the spaces between what was seen and what was felt. This was one such place where the veil between the mortal world and the other world thinned to the width of a breath. A whisper rode the wind, a voice both familiar and strange. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkness, but the forest remained still. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a woman wrapped in a cloak of night, her raven hair flowing like ink against pale skin. Her gaze was sharp, unsettling, as if she saw beyond flesh and into the soul itself. He knew her name before she spoke it. "The Morrigan," he murmured, and the name felt heavy on his tongue, as though speaking it summoned something far greater than himself. She stepped closer, her presence shifting the air like a storm on the horizon. "You walk a path few dare to tread," she said, her voice neither warm nor cold, but something in between, like the hush before a battle cry. "The gods have not forgotten this land, but the people have. They turn away from the old ways, and in doing so, they weaken the bonds that hold this world together." The traveler swallowed, feeling the weight of unseen forces pressing against him. "The stories are still told," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Names still whispered by those who remember." She tilted her head, a slow, knowing smile curving her lips. "Whispers are not enough," she said. "A storm is coming. The land stirs, the old wounds reopen, and the cycle turns once more. The gods do not ask for worship, but they do not forgive being forgotten." The words sent a shiver through him, not from fear, but from the undeniable truth within them. He had felt it too, the unease in the wind, the way the rivers seemed to murmur warnings in the dead of night. The balance had been shifting for some time, tilting towards something unseen but inevitable. "What must be done?" he asked. The Morrigan's eyes darkened, as if shadows swirled within them. "You seek answers, but are you ready for the cost of knowing them?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and unbroken. The traveler knew the weight of fate was was not easily carried, and the gods did not give without taking something in return. But he had come this far, and he could not turn away now. "I am ready," he said. The Morrigan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She raised a hand, and the wind howled, circling them like a living thing. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the stones around them pulsed with an unseen force. Then, with a whisper of feathers, she was gone, leaving only the echo of her words behind. The traveler stood alone in the night, the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. The veil had been lifted, if only for a moment, and now there was no turning back. The gods were waiting. The night stretched long and silent, yet the traveler did not move. The Morrigan's presence had vanished like mist in the morning sun, but her words clung to the air, weaving themselves into his thoughts like tangled roots. A storm was coming. The balance was shifting, and the gods had not forgotten. He turned back to the ancient stones, his fingers tracing the spirals carved by hands long turned to dust. If this place was truly a threshold, then there had to be a way through. The other world was not a distant paradise. It was woven into the fabric of this land, just beyond the reach of those who had forgotten how to see it. The wind picked up, stirring the leaves and carrying the scent of salt, though the sea was miles away. The traveler stiffened. He knew this presence as well, though he had never seen it with his own eyes. The waves whispered his name before he even turned. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a man clad in a cloak that shimmered like the ocean beneath moonlight. His eyes were like the shifting tide, deep and unreadable, holding storms and serenity in equal measure. At his side, a sword gleamed faintly, its edge humming with a power that did not belong to this world. Mannanon Mac Lur, the traveler breathed. The sea god smiled, though there was something knowing in it, something ancient. "You have walked farther than most," he said, his voice carrying the cadence of waves lapping against the shore. "But the path ahead is not for the faint of heart. The other world does not open its doors freely." The traveler squared his shoulders. "I must go." Mannanon studied him for a long moment before stepping forward, the mist curling around his feet. "Then you must know this. The veil is not simply crossed. It must be earned." He raised his hand, and from nowhere, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the trees and stones until the world felt like a dream. The other world is not kind to those who seek it unprepared. You may find wonders beyond imagining, but you may also find yourself lost, never to return. The traveler did not waver. "I will take that risk." Mannanon's expression did not change, but the sea wind carried something like approval. "Very well," he said. "But know this, when you cross into the other world, you do not go alone. You carry the weight of the gods, of the land, of the stories that still whisper in the bones of the earth." The traveler nodded. "Then let the journey begin." The sea god extended a hand, and as the traveler took it, the world around them shifted. The mist thickened, the stars above blurred, and the ground beneath his feet gave way to something else, something ancient, something beyond time. And just like that, the veil parted. The moment the traveler stepped forward, the air around him thickened. No longer the crisp night breeze of the mortal world, but something dense, humming with unseen forces. The ground beneath his feet felt weightless, as if he were treading upon mist itself. Shadows twisted in unfamiliar shapes, forming landscapes that shifted between recognition and impossibility. The sky above burned with colors that had no name, shifting like liquid gold and silver, as if time itself bled into the heavens. This was the other world, the land of gods and spirits, where reality wove itself anew with each breath. Manannán mac Lir stood beside him, his cloak rippling like the tides, though no wind stirred. "You have crossed the threshold," the sea god murmured, his voice carrying the depth of waves crashing upon forgotten shores. "But your journey has only begun." The traveler turned, his senses sharpening to the strange beauty around him. The land stretched vast and boundless, rolling hills covered in emerald grass, rivers that shimmered like liquid starlight, trees with leaves that whispered songs in tongues long lost. And yet, for all its beauty, there was something unsettling about it, something watching, something waiting. The other world did not welcome mortals without purpose. "Where must I go?" he asked, his voice steady despite the weight pressing upon his soul. Manannán gestured toward the horizon where the land seemed to bend, curling upon itself in endless spirals. "The Dagda waits. If you seek answers, he is the one who holds them." The traveler had heard of the Dagda, the Great Father, the god of life and death, the keeper of the cauldron that never emptied. His presence alone could shape the world, his laughter enough to shake the heavens. With a final glance at the sea god, the traveler set forth, each step feeling as though he were moving through a story being woven around him. The path twisted beneath his feet, never staying the same for long, as if the land itself was testing him. Shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, figures that melted into mist when he tried to focus on them. Time here did not move as it did in the mortal world. A single step could stretch into hours, and an hour could slip away in a breath. The traveler pressed on, his resolve unshaken even as the land whispered in voices he could not understand. Then, as if the world had decided he was worthy, the landscape shifted once more, and he found himself standing before an ancient oak, so massive it seemed to hold the sky aloft. Beneath its boughs sat a figure unlike any other. The Dagda. He was immense, his form radiating power that made the air tremble. His beard, thick and wild, cascaded down his chest like rivers of shadow and light. His eyes, dark as the depths of the earth, held the wisdom of ages untold. Across his lap rested his great club, a weapon that could end life with one end and restore it with the other. And beside him, a cauldron vast and bottomless, from which the scent of feast and fire rose. He regarded the traveler with a gaze that felt like the turning of seasons, slow and inevitable. "You have come far," the Dagda rumbled, his voice like the crackling of a hearth in winter, steady and warm, yet holding the weight of thunder. Few dare tread this path, and fewer still are permitted to stand before me. The traveler met his gaze, unflinching. I seek understanding. The balance of the world shifts, and the gods stir. I wish to know why. The Dagda let out a low, knowing chuckle, the sound rolling through the air like distant storms. The world does not shift on its own. It moves because men have forgotten. The old ways, the sacred bonds, the stories that once held power, these are fading. And with them, the strength that keeps the veil in place. When men cease to honor the land ceases to shelter them. The traveler felt the weight of those words settle deep within him. He had seen the truth of it in the mortal world, the forests cut away, the rivers choked with silence, the stones that once bore the names of gods left to crumble beneath time's indifference. Can it be undone? He asked. The Dagda leaned forward, the air thickening with the gravity of his presence. That is not for the gods to decide. The world belongs to those who walk upon it. If men choose to remember, to honor, to listen once more, then balance may yet be restored. But should they continue to forget, then the veil will tear, and what lies beyond will no longer wait in silence. The traveler shivered, for he understood the warning hidden within those words. The other world was not a mere reflection of the mortal realm. It was a force in its own right, a place where gods and spirits still walked, where fate was not bound by the laws of men. If the veil shattered, if the balance truly broke, then what would step through would not be gentle. The Dagda studied him for a long moment before lifting his hand. "Take this," he said, and from the air, a single ember floated toward the traveler, glowing with a warmth that seeped into his very bones. "It is a spark of the old flame. Carry it with you. Let it burn in the hearts of those who still remember. And if the time comes when the darkness presses too close, let it guide you back to the light." The traveler reached out, and as his fingers closed around the ember, the world around him shifted once more. The great oak, the Dagda, the endless sky of the other world, all began to blur, unraveling like a dream upon waking. The wind howled, the mist coiled, and before he could take another breath, he was standing once more beneath the ancient stones where his journey had begun. But something had changed. The air was heavier, the land humming beneath his feet with a pulse that had not been there before. The ember still glowed in his palm, warm and steady, a reminder that what he had seen, what he had learned, was not just a vision. It was a call to action. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the dawn was beginning to break, washing the land in gold and crimson. The journey was not over. The storm was still coming, and the gods were watching. The ember pulsed in the traveler's palm, its warmth a steady reminder that the other world was never truly gone, only waiting beneath the surface of things. He stood among the ancient stones, the whispers of the land curling around him like breath on a cold morning. The world had shifted, yet the forest still stood, the rivers still ran, the sky still stretched endless above him. But something unseen stirred in the marrow of the earth, something restless. The gods had spoken, and their message was clear. He closed his fingers around the ember, feeling its quiet strength seep into his skin, and turned toward the path that led away from the sacred place. The journey was not over. The veil had not yet torn, but the fabric of the world was fraying at the edges, and the balance hung by a thread. He did not know where the road would lead him, only that it was his to walk. The morning air was crisp, laced with the scent of damp moss and pine. The sky still streaked with the last embers of night. Each step carried him deeper into the unknown, though the land was familiar, the same hills and valleys that had cradled his people for centuries, the same winding rivers that had whispered stories before men learned to speak them aloud. And yet, something was different. The silence held weight, a tension that curled in the spaces between the trees. The land was listening. As he walked, the birds fell silent. The wind stilled. A presence pressed against the edges of his awareness, a force older than kings, older than the names carved into stone. Then, from the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged. She moved like the shifting of the seasons, her presence both gentle and unyielding, the weight of her gaze settling upon him like the hush before a storm. Her hair flowed like fire and river light, her eyes deep as the wells that held the secrets of the world. He knew her, though he had never seen her face before. "Bridget," he murmured, the name a breath upon the wind. She did not speak at first, only regarded him with something like sorrow, something like hope. When she stepped closer, the warmth of her presence wrapped around him, different from the Morrigan's storm-shadowed power, different from Mananon's ever-shifting tide. This was the warmth of the hearth, the forge, the first light of dawn after a long winter. "You have been given a task," she said at last, her voice soft but unwavering. "The ember you carry is not merely light. It is remembrance. It is the fire of creation, of stories untold, of the bonds that once wove the world together. But a flame must be tended, lest it flicker and die." The traveler tightened his grip on the ember, feeling the truth in her words settle deep within him. "How do I keep it alive?" Bridget's gaze did not waver. "By lighting others." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of the world. The traveler felt the enormity of them press upon his soul. This was not a task for one man alone. The gods did not ask for temples or sacrifice. They did not demand thrones or war banners. They asked for remembrance, for stories to be spoken by firelight, for the land to be honored, for the rivers and stones to be seen not as lifeless things, but as the living breath of the world itself. Bridget reached forward, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment he saw the land as it had been, green and golden beneath skies that knew no sorrow. The people moving through it, their voices raised in song, their hands weaving, shaping, building. The old ways alive, not in fear, not in blind devotion, but in reverence, in understanding. The gods walking among them, not as rulers, but as kin, as guides, as the steady presence that watched over the shifting tide of time. Then, as swiftly as the vision came, it was gone, leaving only the ember's warmth in his hand. Bridget stepped back, the edges of her form already beginning to blur, as if she were never meant to linger long in one place. "The world does not ask for grand gestures," she said, her voice like the crackle of a steady flame. "Only that you remember, that you remind others. Light the fires, speak the names, and the gods will not be lost." And then, like mist rising with the morning sun, she was gone. The traveler stood alone once more, but the weight in his heart had shifted. The ember burned steady in his palm, and with it, the path ahead was clearer than before. He was not meant to wage war. He was not meant to force the world to change. He was meant to remind it of what it had once known. He turned toward the horizon, toward the villages and cities where the old ways had faded into quiet memory. He would walk among them. He would tell the stories. He would light the fires. And perhaps, just perhaps, the gods would not be forgotten. The traveler walked with purpose now, his steps no longer hesitant, his path no longer uncertain. The ember in his palm pulsed gently, not with fire that burned, but with a warmth that settled deep into his bones. The world was not silent as he had once thought. The land breathed, the trees whispered, the rivers murmured. All had been waiting not for the gods to return, but for the people to listen once more. His journey took him first to a village nestled in the valley, where smoke curled from thatched rooftops, and the scent of freshly tilled earth clung to the air. He was a stranger here, yet the people did not turn him away. They welcomed him as wanderers had always been welcomed, offering food and a place by the fire, a seat among those who gathered as dusk settled over the land. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows upon the faces of those who had gathered. The traveler sat among them, the ember warm against his palm, and as the night deepened, he spoke. He told them of the old ways, not as relics of the past, but as truths woven into the very fabric of the world. He spoke of the Tuatha De Danann, of the gods who once walked among men, not as distant rulers, but as kin. He told of the Dagda, whose laughter could shake the sky, whose cauldron never emptied. He spoke of Bridget, who carried the fire of creation, of healing and poetry, of the forge and the hearth. He whispered of Manannán Mac Lir, who walked the shifting tides between worlds, and of the Morrigan, whose voice carried the weight of fate itself. The villagers listened, their eyes reflecting the firelight, their faces shifting from quiet curiosity to something deeper. Recognition, memory. These were not stories they had never heard. These were echoes of something once known, buried beneath the weight of time and forgetting. The old names stirred, rising from the depths of silence, carried once more upon the breath of those who dared to remember. As the night stretched on, the traveler reached into his cloak and pulled forth the ember. It glowed softly, casting no great light, yet it illuminated something beyond the physical. He placed it at the center of the fire, and as the flames licked around it, something shifted. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that did not belong to this world alone. The fire burned brighter, steadier, as if it too had been waiting. The villagers gasped, some leaning forward in awe, others whispering quiet prayers they had long forgotten. The traveler smiled. "The gods are not gone," he said, his voice steady. "They are only waiting to be called home." The fire burned long into the night, and when dawn broke, it had not died. The villagers, who had once lived in quiet detachment from the old ways, now carried something new in their eyes, a light, a remembrance. The traveler left them with the ember still burning in their hearth, tended by hands that had once forgotten, but now knew how to keep the flame alive. And so he moved on to the next village, the next town, the next quiet place where silence had settled for too long. He carried no banners, wielded no sword, made no demands. He only spoke, only told, only reminded. And where his voice traveled, the fires began to burn anew. The world stirred. The gods watched. And the ember, no longer alone, had found its way into many hands. The traveler pressed onward, the road stretching before him like an unspooled thread woven into the fabric of fate. He did not stay long in any one place, for the ember he carried was not meant to be kept. It was meant to be shared. Wherever he went, he left behind more than stories. He left flames burning in the hearts of those who had forgotten, rekindling something that had lain dormant for far too long. Villages that had once whispered of gods only in passing now spoke their names freely, not as distant myths, but as kin who had walked the land before them. The fields bore offerings once more. The rivers carried prayers upon their currents, and the standing stones, long abandoned to the passage of time, were touched with reverence again. But not all welcomed the return of the old ways. There were those who had built their power upon silence, who had benefited from the forgetting. The traveler felt their eyes upon him long before they revealed themselves. In the city of stone towers and narrow streets, where the old gods had been pushed into the shadows, he was met not with open arms, but with suspicion. A gathering awaited him in the market square. But this was no village firelit with curiosity. This was a place where belief had hardened into walls, where men had declared the past buried and the future shaped by their own hands. The people who gathered did not sit in eager silence. They murmured, their voices edged with doubt, with wariness. The traveler stood before them, the ember hidden in the folds of his cloak, and spoke as he always had. He spoke of the land, of the rivers that had known the touch of gods, of the winds that still carried their voices. He spoke of the Morrigan, who wove the threads of fate, of Lug, whose many skills had shaped the world of Brigid, whose flame burned in every forge, every home, every poem whispered to the night. But as his words filled the air, a voice cut through them, sharp as a blade. Lies, it spat, and the crowd shifted, drawn to the challenge like embers to dry wood. A man stepped forward, cloaked in dark robes, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of those who feared the past they could not control. The old ways are dead. The gods are dead. The traveler met his gaze, unshaken. If they are dead, why do you fear their names? A ripple passed through the crowd, the weight of the question settling upon them. The man's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Because names are dangerous," he said, voice low but filled with warning. "Names carry power, power that is best left buried." The traveler stepped forward, and from within his cloak, he drew the ember. It glowed with the warmth of firelight, steady and unwavering. Power is not meant to be buried. It is meant to be shared, to be tended, to be remembered. The air grew heavy, the world holding its breath. The ember pulsed once, twice, and then the wind stirred, carrying whispers not born of mortal lips. The people felt it, even if they did not understand. The gods had never been gone. They had only been waiting. The man in dark robes faltered, his certainty cracking like ice beneath a spring thaw. The traveler did not move, did not force, did not command. He only stood, only held, only reminded. And one by one, the people turned toward the flame. The ember burned steady in the traveler's palm. Its glow reflected in the wide eyes of those who had gathered. The man in the dark robes stood rigid, his breath shallow, his certainty unraveling in the face of something older than his defiance. The weight of silence pressed upon them all, thick with the presence of something unseen, something waiting. Then a woman stepped forward. She was not young nor old, but carried the weariness of someone who had lived between forgetting and remembering. Her gaze flickered between the ember and the traveler's face, and when she spoke, her voice was soft yet unshaken. "My grandmother once spoke of the old gods," she said, as if the words had been locked behind her lips for years. "She told me stories of Brigid, of Lug, of the Dagda, but we stopped speaking their names." The traveler turned toward her, his expression steady. "Why?" The woman swallowed. "Because we were told it was foolish, that we had no need for them anymore." The ember pulsed, warm as the sun breaking through morning mist. "And yet, you remember." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of the moment settling into their bones. The people looked to one another, seeing in each other the echoes of things they had pushed aside, stories left untold, songs left unsung, traditions abandoned not because they were meaningless, but because they had been made to believe they were. The traveler stepped forward, lowering the ember until it rested between them, not as something to be feared, but as something to be embraced. "The gods do not demand worship," he said, his voice carrying through the air like the first gust of wind before a coming storm. "They do not seek thrones or power. They ask only to be remembered, to be known, to walk beside us as they always have." A man at the edge of the crowd let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A mother pulled her child closer, as if to shield her from something unseen, yet she did not turn away. The old woman who had spoken first took another step forward, her fingers trembling as they reached toward the ember, and as she touched it, the fire leapt, not with destruction, not with fury, but with recognition. The flames rose in golden waves, not consuming, but embracing. And for the briefest of moments, the veil between worlds thinned. Shadows flickered at the edges of sight, figures standing just beyond reach, watching, waiting. The gods were listening. The traveler did not move. He only watched as the people stepped forward, one by one, each adding their own fire to the growing flame. A candle was lit, a torch raised. The embers spread not in destruction, but in remembrance, in the quiet yet unyielding truth that the past was never truly lost. The man in the dark robes stood motionless, his face unreadable. Perhaps he had known all along that the gods had never truly left. Perhaps fear had shaped his defiance more than belief. But he did not stop them. He did not speak again. He only turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving the firelight behind. And when the traveler looked up, the night sky stretched endless above him, the stars burning brighter than they had in an age. The wind stirred, carrying with it the laughter of something vast and unseen. The gods had not returned. They had never been gone. The traveler smiled. His journey was not over, nor would it ever truly be. For as long as voices spoke their names, as long as fires burned in the hearths of those who still believed, the gods would walk with them. Not above, not beyond, but here in the land, in the rivers, in the whispering wind. The balance had shifted once more, and this time the world remembered. The fire burned through the night, but the traveler did not linger to see the dawn. The ember had been passed, the spark had caught, and the old ways were beginning to weave themselves back into the world. But as he walked the winding roads away from the city, he felt it, the cold weight of something watching, something that did not belong to fire or memory, something that had been waiting in silence for far too long. The traveler had spent his journey awakening gods, but not all slumbered peacefully. There were names that had been buried, not out of forgetfulness, but out of fear. Some forces did not wish to be remembered. Some gods had been cast away for a reason. The wind carried no whispers now, only a stillness too thick, too heavy, as if the land itself hesitated to breathe. Then, from the edges of the road, the shadows stretched, twisting in unnatural shapes. A figure emerged, neither man nor beast, draped in darkness that rippled like water. Its eyes burned with something ancient, something starved. "You have woken them," the voice rasped, though it did not move its lips. "And in doing so, you have woken me." The traveler clenched his fist around the ember, feeling its warmth steady against his palm. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, something like amusement flickering in its hollow gaze. "A name long forgotten, a god buried by those who feared what I was. The others were loved, revered, whispered to in prayer. But I, the shadows writhed around it. I was erased. The traveler had heard of many gods, but not this one. Why?" The figure stepped closer, and the air thickened with an unseen pressure. "Because I do not give, I take. do not bless, I devour. When men called upon me, they did so not in worship, but in desperation. In war, in famine, in the moments before death, when all other gods turned away. It paused, and now, thanks to you, I have been remembered. The traveler's grip on the ember tightened. He had spent his journey lighting flames, awakening names that had been lost, but he had never considered what else might rise with them. The gods do not walk alone, he said carefully. Even those forgotten are bound to the balance of the world. If you have returned, it is not by my doing, but by the turning of the wheel itself. The figure's laughter was like wind through dead branches. You speak of balance, yet you have upset it yourself. You think the gods are grateful, that they wish to return. It leaned closer, its breath cold as winter's bite. Not all gods wish to be remembered. The traveler did not move. The ember burned bright in his palm, defying the dark. Then, why have you come? The shadows curled tighter, as if the thing had expected another answer, another fear. To see, it murmured. To watch what you have done. To witness if men will turn to the light you have given them. Or if they will, as they always have, call upon the darkness when the fire burns too bright. The air grew still again, and when the traveler blinked, the figure was gone. Only the shadows remained, stretching long beneath the pale light of dawn. The ember flickered in his hand, steady, unwavering. The path was not yet finished. There was still one more step to take. The road stretched long before him, but the traveler no longer walked alone. The gods stirred in the rivers and the winds, their presence lingering in the edges of sight, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. The ember in his palm pulsed with a warmth that was no longer just his own. It carried the voices of those who had remembered, the hands that had tended the fires, the stories that had risen from the silence. But beneath that warmth, beneath the steady hum of the world awakening once more, he felt it, the whisper of something else. The forgotten god had not come to threaten him, not yet, but its presence curled at the edges of the world like storm clouds gathering beyond the horizon. The traveler knew the choice he faced. Fire was light, but it was also destruction. Memory was a gift, but it was also a burden. The gods had returned, but men were fickle, and the past had not always been kind. The ember could not be carried forever. It was not meant for one hand alone. It had to be passed, not just to those who remembered, but to those who would carry it forward into what lay ahead. And so, as the road led him to the final village, he did not stop at the hearths of elders or the temples long abandoned. He did not call upon those who had already begun to listen. Instead, he sought out the ones who had yet to understand, the children. They gathered at the edges of the fields, their laughter light as birds in the morning sky, their hands covered in earth and play. They did not yet know the weight of the world, did not yet know the names that had been spoken into the fire. But they would. The traveler knelt before them, the ember glowing softly in his palm. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. The children peered at it, their eyes reflecting its golden light. "A fire," one asked. "A star," said another. The traveler smiled. "A story." They leaned closer, curious, waiting. And so he told them not of war, not of loss, not of the battles between gods and men, but of the world as it had been, as it still was, if only they chose to see it. He spoke of rivers that carried the laughter of spirits, of forests that whispered the secrets of time. He told them of Bridget's flame, of Mananon's tides, of Lug's golden spear. He spoke of the Morrigan, not as a thing to be feared, but as a reminder that every end was only a beginning. And as he spoke, the ember in his palm grew lighter, its warmth spreading from his hand to theirs, until it no longer belonged to him at all. The children, eyes alight with wonder, took it in their hands, passing it between them, their laughter ringing through the fields like the first song of spring. The traveler rose, his hands now empty, yet he felt no loss. The fire had been given, the stories had found new voices, and the gods would not fade again, not while there were still those who would listen. He turned toward the road once more, toward whatever lay beyond the horizon. The darkness still lingered at the edges of the world, waiting, watching. But the fire had been lit. And so long as even one voice spoke their names, the gods would walk beside them, not as rulers, not as forgotten relics, but as part of the world, as they had always been.